This is episode 129 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at castycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Scott Newstock, author of How to Think Like Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The so-called 30-pound knights. These were people who were created as barons or gentlemen by paying money to the king. And the worry that some of these gentlemen were not really deserving of the status is a theme of plays like Ben Jonson's Eastward Ho, which is a kind of comedy about an undeserving kind of knight. And even in a play like The Tempest, a character like Gonzalo talks about a commonwealth, a utopia where everyone can be idle. And I think that is also raising the point about, can a gentleman afford to be idle by virtue of honor or birth, or does it actually lead to trouble, as it does in the play?
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Society in Elizabethan England is well known for being divided up by class. There were workers, peasants, aristocracy, and even a kind of middle class. But what was the definition of a laborer? When it comes to exploring the roles of characters like Ariel and Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest, it's important to understand the 16th century mindset towards labor. Under Catholic England, the monasteries had decided that they placed a higher value on the ability to commune with your thoughts and labor at intellectual pursuits, whereas Protestant England leaned toward a more active physical labor as being more valuable, particularly with an emphasis on trades like making gloves, shoes, or wool. The practical aspects of everyday life in England, like food to eat, houses to live in, and clothes to wear, were all built on the value of craftsmen, tradesmen, servants, laborers, and what Henry V might have called England's yeomen. But what is an industrious servant precisely? Can we recognize one when we see them on stage? What are the appearances, actions, or conditions of a servant for Tudor England? And what was Shakespeare trying to draw attention to with characters like Ariel, who spends most of the play, The Tempest, yearning for his freedom? To explore the realities of servanthood, including where superstition overlaps with practicality to create a suspicion of magic associated with good craftsmanship, is our guest, James Tink. James Tink is Associate Professor in the Department of English Literature, School of Arts and Letters at Tohoku University, Sendai, Japan. He researches Shakespeare and early modern English literature and has recently published in volumes including Shakespeare and Money, edited by Graham Holderness for 2020, and Literature and London from 1603 to 1901, edited by Barnaby Ralph and others in 2017. He also writes on contemporary British literature and is co-editor of the essay collection Seeing Animals After Derrida from Lexington Books in 2018. His profile is at academia.edu. Hello, James. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thank you for having me.
In his research, James defines the idea of a gentleman with a reference from 1583 saying, quote, "The Tudor humanist Thomas Smith had stated that he who can live idly and without manual labor and will bear the port, charge, and countenance of a gentleman shall be taken for a gentleman," end quote. James, does this definition suggest that being a gentleman was more about looking the part than any kind of character quality?
I think so. I think when Smith wrote that statement, he was possibly anxious about the fact that maybe gentlemen were not accorded the sort of honor or status that they were supposed to be using. But It's also the important word is the idea of idleness. A gentleman can be idle because he's entitled not to work through the status of honor. And it was the suspicion that people were idle who hadn't really deserved to be gentlemen that I think he was worried about. So during the time of Shakespeare and King James I, you had the rise of the so-called £30 knights. These were people who were created as barons or gentlemen by paying money to the king. And the worry that some of these gentlemen were not really deserving of the status is a theme of plays like Ben Jonson's Eastward Ho, which is a kind of comedy about an undeserving kind of knight. And even in a play like The Tempest, a character like Gonzalo talks about a commonwealth, a utopia, where everyone can be idle. And I think that is also raising the point about, can a gentleman afford to be idle by virtue of honor or birth, or does it actually lead to trouble, as it does in the play?
James's research explores a connection between the characters of Ariel and Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest to that of Cain and Abel in the Bible. James, why do you think these two stories are related?
Well, the story of Cain was popular with medieval miracle and mystery plays, particularly the Cain and Abel play. This is perhaps before Shakespeare's adult lifetime, but it is a tradition in English drama to present the first murder, and particularly Cain as a particularly abhorrent form of a kind of human. So in Hamlet, when Hamlet is in the gravediggers scene, he refers to Cain as the first murder when he's looking at the skull. But what interested me was to what extent Francis Bacon chose to use the Cain and Abel story in his book, The Advancement of Learning, and whether it was the coupling of a particularly wretched character and then another character that became the basis of Caliban and Ariel. So I wondered if like the Cain and Abel story was something that was in the back of Shakespeare's mind when he was writing The Tempest.
At the same time Shakespeare was writing The Tempest, you say that Francis Bacon is writing about it in The Advancement of Learning, as well as John Florio's Montaigne, both considered potential sources for Shakespeare's play. Does this plethora of sources telling the same tale about the morality of hard work suggest that this debate over the purpose of labor was a hot topic for the 16th century?
Yeah, I think it was, because if you think of the 16th century as a century of trying to form a poor law, of trying what to do with what we would call unemployment, but they called idleness or vagrancy. And it really goes to the abolition of the monasteries, the disappearance of charity as a particular Catholic ritual to maintain the poor and preserve poor relief, and the need to kind of secularize the treatment of labor and idleness. I think there is quite a common theme throughout Shakespeare and many other writers about this idea of the best use of labor and the problem of what they called idleness or vagrancy, which you perhaps also see in the play with the Revolt of Caliban.
Culturally, during Shakespeare's lifetime, was there a distinction being made between physical labor and intellectual labor?
Yes, and it goes back a very long way in culture. It's really the difference between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, the idea of a life based on work or activity and a life based on contemplation. In some ways, it goes back to the Bible, to the New Testament. It's actually the story of Jesus, Mary, and Martha. Okay? I think in the New Testament, Jesus is the house guest of Mary and Martha. Martha is working very busily in the kitchen to keep Jesus entertained, whereas Mary sits quietly by him and washes his feet. And I think Mary is praised as the better response to Jesus's guest than Martha in Luke's gospel. Now, that has a big influence on thinking about two types of labor. Is contemplative life superior to active life? And for a long time, monastic culture saw contemplative life as superior to laborious life. So I think there is a long tradition, which Jennifer Summit talks about in her essay, in which these two forms of labor are kind of explored through scriptural study, but also through literature. A work like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is in some ways looking at the different varieties of work in 14th century England. Some is manual work, some is closer to scholarly or more contemplative work.
Okay, so there was this exploration of the two different kinds going on, and monasteries obviously made a choice about which one they felt was best. But what about William Shakespeare and contemporary 16th century culture? Was there one version of labor considered more valuable than the other?
That's a really interesting point, because one way of looking at the 17th century is the way in which the idea of manual work, the kind of vita activa, is seen as having a kind of value over contemplative life, or at least being equal to vita contemplativa. And perhaps this is to do with the abolition of the monasteries and move away from monasticism in Protestant England. But there's certainly a sense by Shakespeare's time that the idea that the good life could actually involve both disciplines of active work and monastic work and contemplative work was being explored.
How was this perspective received in the audience when most people in the seats at the Globe would have been these kinds of artisans or craftsmen or laborers, the vita activa that you mentioned?
Again, this is a really fascinating question, because it comes down to the mystery of what did the audiences really think about Shakespeare's play. I mean, if you think of something like A Midsummer Night's Dream, you've got the artisans presented in a very comic, ridiculous fashion. And you might think that some of the audience would take offense at that. But clearly, Midsummer Night's Dream is a fantastically popular play, and many people were in on the joke. I mean, it's worth thinking about Shakespeare's plays in the context of London. So many Londoners were apprentices. Being an apprentice to an artisan was a way to become a citizen of London. It was the main route of social mobility and social status for non-gentlemen in London. Moreover, we think that even Shakespeare's play company and the acting companies had apprentices. The boy actors were apprentices being trained in a skill of acting. So there's certainly a way to think that the social life of London was being represented in the playhouses largely through forms of city comedy, which of course Shakespeare didn't really write compared to his contemporaries. Yeah, it does very much seem to be something which would be of interest to the audiences.
James's paper draws a really fun parallel between craftsmanship and magic when he says, quote, modes of artisanal craft and specialist knowledge in the 16th century could be represented as a form of secret knowledge comparable to magic, end quote. James, what was the contemporary mindset concerning magic for the 16th century, and how is this related to specialist trades?
That's such a big topic, and my approach is actually a very rational and rather boring one. That by magic, the word often really included ideas of craft or technique. There was a genre of the Book of Secrets in the 16th century, which claims to tell readers the secret arts of how to make things happen. Some of this might be magic in the general sense we think of a magus, or a character like John Dee doing something supernatural. But in some of the contents of the books, it's really quite practical techniques, like how to make an optical instrument. Particularly the historian Joanna Picciotto has done some really interesting work on how in the 17th century, types of artisan and technical knowledge overlap with ideas of magic in the sense of making things happen or finding cause and effects for various factors. And this leads to a kind of proliferation of literature. And this is the context in which a writer like Francis Bacon, most definitely not a magician, is trying to write about the advancement of learning, about discovery, about experiment as a form of technique. So yeah, there's a whole way in which I think the skills of the trade of wanting to learn how to do something could be represented as magic. And I should add as well, one important feature of being an apprentice in the medieval and Renaissance period is a promise to maintain the secrets of your master. That could just be family confidence, of course, but it also does imply ideas of craft technique and skill and what used to be guild knowledge as a kind of professional expertise.
Sort of protecting the house recipe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A kind of way in which labor preserves its kind of particular skills and knowledge at that time. Yeah. So I think there are lots of ways in which we can safely say that magic describes just a type of technique or a procedure of knowledge that overlapped with some ideas of artisanal craft. So again, Keith Thomas has this amazing anecdote of carpenters being arrested for sorcery because people couldn't believe how they actually got the wood to be that good, So it's kind of I'd love to know more about that myself.
That's not exactly a motivation to be really good at what you do, I have to.
No. Yeah.
Now, the dialogue of the characters is not the only place James found evidence for these built-in statements in favor of what he calls the industrious servant. He also shows a clear distinction being made by Shakespeare between Caliban and Ariel that's found in the stage directions. James, what actions did Shakespeare assign for the character of Ariel on stage, and how do those things demonstrate this cultural idea of an industrious servant?
I think what's striking about Ariel is how much work he or she has to do, like the amount of music they perform. They have to perform presumably on a lute in Act 2. They perform on a tabor and drum. They sing several songs throughout the play. They act in the as the character of Ceres in The Mask. So there's a lot of theatrical work being done constantly on stage. There's also the fact that although Prospero says early in the play that Ariel will be invisible to every other character, he's obviously visible to the audience. He has a very busy stage presence throughout the play. The other factor that makes it a servant is the famous idea of Ariel wanting his freedom. Okay, an apprentice was usually indentured to a master for 7 years in Renaissance England. And we think sometimes a rather strict master might try and protract that term of indenture. And it became a cause of kind of bitterness for apprentices. So I wonder if Ariel's idea of a longing to be free, which has many different meanings in the play, of course, could be understood as something like the basic contract of the servant or apprentice to a master just wanting to be released.
So in modern terms, though, is Ariel a slave to Prospero in Shakespeare's The Tempest?
That is a difficult question. I would probably be cautious and say it is a figure of indentured labor. It is the fact that there is a loss of freedom while working as a type of apprentice to a Elizabethan London guild master or artisan. But there is always the guarantee or the promise of being released and made independent at the end, which is a big difference. I mean, in modern terms, I've sometimes wondered if we could think of Ariel as kind of like a figure of the intern, or even in modern terms, the kind of affective laborer, if we want to call that idea of somebody whose job is to make other people feel better or occasionally feel worse, like the way he has to frighten various people in the play. So I'm kind of interested in a slightly contemporary or even presentist reading of the play that would try and think of Ariel as, like a lot of people, contemporary workers, not able perhaps to have as much independence in their use of their skills as a Wyke and obviously demonstrably could do. Ariel has all these magical powers which are constrained by service to Prospero. So I probably wouldn't call him a slave so much as the kind of put upon worker. But if I might add, I said about he or she, and that's because although I realize Ariel is identified as he in the play, Ariel was probably performed by a boy actor. They seem to have worked out that that was the most likely. Boy actors, of course, are expected to play women in Shakespearean plays. Many of the disguises of Ariel are feminine, like the sea nymph. And there was a long tradition in the 18th and early 19th century of Ariel being a woman's part in stage directions. So I kind of think there's a kind of gender ambiguity to Ariel. I think there's things that could be explored there as well.
Well, from the history of Ariel in performance, as well as the concept of an industrious servant and laboring contemptibly versus actively, are all things that I know we would love to just explore further. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Okay. I think that a play, Eastward Ho, by Chapman, Johnson, and Marston, is a city comedy from 1605. It's about apprentices and gentlemen and idle gentlemen, and it's also about sailing to America to make money, although it all ends rather badly. And many years ago, the scholar Andrew Gurr suggested that we read The Tempest alongside Eastward Ho to try and think about the kind of dynamics of London in the play, the relationships between masters and servants. So it's an enjoyable comedy in itself. So that would be one place to look. Also, Joanna Piochetto's Labours of Innocence in Early Modern England is not so much about Shakespeare, but it's an excellent study of the 17th century and the way in which active life, manual life, emerges as the kind of paradigm of science and experiment in the 17th century, as opposed to contemplative life. And she mostly looks at Milton and the Royal Society, but I think it's and Francis Bacon, and I think that's an interesting extension. For thinking about servants, Steve Rappaport's book, Worlds Within Worlds, is a work of economic history. It's a fascinating source of data and statistics on the nature of London life, on the livery companies, on the lives of apprentices and services, and the many different statuses that existed between people, young people and middle-aged people in the city of London through work. I've always found that a very interesting way to think about Shakespeare's plays and Renaissance plays, not only because of the content, but because of the kind of people who were going to see the plays.
Those are excellent resources for sure. We will link to all of these as well as James's work in the show notes for today's episode. You can find those at casticash.com/episode 128. So make sure you check out all of those resources there. James, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Okay, this is the Desert Island Discs question, isn't it?
It absolutely is, yes.
I think I'm allowed 8 records as well, but well, I don't know about that. I've been thinking about this. I'm based in Japan, and I'm interested in Japanese literature. And if I was on an island for a long time, I'd want a long book. So I'd probably take Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikabue.
You'd be well set up on your island with that, yeah.
Yeah, it's sometimes said to be the first novel, but it's certainly like the kind of Mount Fuji of Japanese literature. Like,
so
there's
just
so
some
much
light
depends on
reading.
it. Oh, but it's fun, you see. It is actually kind of light because you can just enjoy little scenes and little comedy, and then you can worry about putting it together later. You know, you have plenty of time to try and work out what the plot is.
Well, that's a fun choice.
Yeah, that would be. But I would hope I would get off the island fairly quickly.
I'm glad you mentioned that. No, for the most part, when people visit with us, they always assume they're going to be there forever. And we really don't say that in the question. So it's interesting that you thought, well, I'm not going to be there very long. That's also a good choice for your desert island.
More like a sabbatical than a kind of lifestyle
just
exile.
A short trip. Short trip. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm trying to keep up with thinking on this ideas of artisans and knowledge. I've been looking at Henry V. I'm interested in the idea of puissance, particularly imaginary puissance at the beginning of that play. because it's a French loanword that isn't used much in the rest of Shakespeare outside of Henry V. And the play itself is also kind of expecting the audience to imaginatively take part in the story the same way that the audience are invited to enjoy the Tempest. So I'm trying to just think about ways in which Shakespeare might try and evoke a kind of fantasy world on the stage, and what kind of imaginative activity, labor, if you like, that involves in the audience and the actors.
Well, James, that sounds like fascinating research, and I know we will look forward to seeing what you come up with when you look into the peasants and Henry V. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us your research into the 16th century mindset about labor and servanthood. This has been a fun conversation, and I thank you for being here.
Thank you very much indeed. I've really liked it.
To find links to the resources James mentions in today's episode, as well as archival images of characters like Ariel from the Tempest and examples of trades in 16th and 17th century England, be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode. We always pack extra history in the show notes here at That Shakespeare Life, and you can find all of these resources and more at CassidyCash.com/episode 129. That's CassidyCash.com/EP129. Would you like to see the video of today's podcast? Our interview with James directly from Japan is located exclusively inside That Shakespeare Life digital streaming app. For just $5 a month, you can have access to all the video episodes of the show, along with animated plays, documentary shorts, history episodes, and more. Find out more and subscribe today at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.